A little quick callback to Carol's thing on the stage earlier. And also to what Bethany said about type events. I first met Carol Waller 29 years ago at a TDC event. I was there with Roger Black, who was presenting a design for Smart Magazine. And since I had a hand in the typefaces, I got to show up as well and talk about type. After the talk, Ed Bengat came over to me and he grabbed the ceremonial, oops, my mic is off. Is that worse? There we go, sorry. Ed Bengat came over and took the ceremonial calendar we were all given and just said, here, let me show you something, and took a permanent marker and began just drawing all over it. But he explained to me how to draw an italic from a Roman in like 2 sketches. It was amazing. And after this little man with white hair, who had a big smile on his face, came over and gave me one of those 2-handed handshakes that people of his generation did, and said, it's great to see people your age involved in type. This is just great. I'm Jerry Craw. And I never saw him again, but his work is great, and I'm sorry to hear that he's passed away. When you guys go home tonight, Google his typefaces. They're terrific. Craw Clarendon, I think, is an important face of the 20th century. So again, back to Bethany. I mean, I was an 18-year-old who knew nothing except how to use Fontographer. And, you know, these 2 incredible luminaries of the last century just came over and shared stuff with me. And that's just incredible. So on that note, I'm here to talk about type. Am I up? Let's see. There we go. Hello. Thanks for having me. Thank you to Kara and Sasha and everyone at Typographics for inviting me. And thank you for Barbara introducing me. Conversely, much of what I know about type I know from Barbara. And for all the years I've made typefaces, my first thought is always, could Barbara use this? And what would she do with it? The thing I'm sharing today is maybe the first thing that I don't know that Barbara would use. But she confessed to me at lunch, she did use it yesterday already. She has a beta copy, so I'm glad to hear it's going well. So 16 years ago this fall, I got married at the Botanic Gardens in Brooklyn. I designed my own invitations, as designers do, and the outer envelopes were written by a calligrapher. I was happy with the way things turned out, but the map kind of vexed me. Setting the map in type felt very institutional, like I was making the map for the Botanic Gardens themselves. And doing it in calligraphy seemed ridiculous. I think of calligraphy as the province of historical maps, and the only modern maps to me that really deserve typography are things from the fantasy realm. So if I'd gotten married in like Mordor, I would have used that, but Prospect Park isn't really quite that bad yet. So neither type nor calligraphy had the right tone. I wanted the versatility of type. I had to create a map that was complex with, parking instructions and subways and things. But it needed to have the kind of natural, warm, genuine feeling of coming from people rather than a place. So I never quite finished the map. I did something in type and it all worked out fine. Still married. Around that time, I got a call from my friend Jesse Scheidlauer. Jesse has the coolest job in the world. And if you think being a typeface designer is esoteric and will rope you into long conversations on airplanes, just you wait. Jesse is a lexicographer who works for the OED, and his job is to write dictionary entries. His specialty is North American Regional English, which means that he and his staff spend their days reading TV scripts, looking at hip-hop album liner notes, reading MySpace pages to find things like the definitive definition of chillax, or like the definitive citation for BFD. This, by the way, is it. This is from his book. Jesse was doing a book called The F Word, which, since there was some swearing this morning, I can just say it's fuck. That's the word it's fuck. But it's a book about fuck and all the various words that are based on this, and it's like 10% vulgar sexual slang, 10% just rude things, and 80% military stuff. It's kind of surprising. But Jesse called about a typeface, and he wanted a typeface that was casually blithe. I think insouciant was the word that he used. But it had to be underpinned by a foundation of scholarship that readers would spot. The book would be entertaining, but it's still a dictionary that the OUP was putting out and needed to present as such. This conversation about tone echoed my wedding invitation map that needed to be personal and non-personal at the same time. But the conversation became fascinating when it turned to the functional requirements too. Dictionaries are amazing things, and though they might use just two typefaces, they use very complex parts of typefaces to articulate different kinds of information in specific ways. Dictionaries and maps, to me, are the two great examples of this. I bring maps up all the time as examples of design that can be sophisticated, and they can use typography to help the user understand things. It becomes clear looking at a map that towns and counties and bodies of water have their own signature style of lettering, and these distinctions run quite deep. A lovely thing that I've probably had this slide in my last 10 talks. Maps typically use blackletter to signal sites from antiquity, and it's a style that blends in if you're not looking for it, but when you are, you can suddenly find all the old churches and Roman ruins and things like that. So I love the way maps use typography as a self-educating UI for users. There's always a legend on the back that people can refer to with questions, but they're rarely needed. You use a map, you figure it out. Well, like all interesting projects, Jesse's dictionary didn't have the time to consider a custom typeface, but the idea stuck with me that there could be a typeface that is informal and functional at the same time. Serious in the sense of thorough, but not serious in the sense of earnest. When I first began designing typefaces, I spent a lot of time advocating for custom typography as a way to end the monoculture of digital fonts. Ilya this morning talking about the world of Roboto and Arial and Times Roman shows that very little has changed in 30 years. It is heartbreaking. But an analogy that I used was to talk about the potential of typography and the actual practice of scribes who could immediately adapt lettering to their will. I wasn't thinking just about formal calligraphy. I mean, all those Renaissance masters who showed off by changing styles in the middle of a page, but also contemporary artists who used lettering in their work for different reasons. One that I loved growing up, and for all I know, this is the actual thing that made me a typeface designer, is Snoopy. Everybody here, I'm sure, knows the iconic lettering of Charles Schulz in Peanuts, but the absolute best part of Snoopy to me was Snoopy at the typewriter, because the lettering would change. And it's such a funny, unexpected, and I think very effective thing to do, to signal to the reader that what you're reading isn't dialogue anymore, but something being written. This is the authorial voice. So I love the way Schulz used lettering to connote in very subliminal ways different kinds of language. Another artist I thought about in this respect is Edward Gorey. If you don't know Edward Gorey, you really should. His stories are great. They are these elegant, deeply subversive, marvelous tales set in a kind of Victorian universe of, you know, ladies with parasols and men with mustaches, and they always involve people being driven slowly insane or small children coming to some horrible fate. They're really just dark. Gorey was a master lettering artist, and I'm thinking not so much about his draftsmanship, but his perceptiveness about letters. The title pages for his stories reveal a love for lettering, and it carries out into the work itself. The lettering is always apropos. He uses the blocky slab serif here to signal old-time baseball uniforms, and the black letter to signify a proverb of some kind. But I love his text most of all. When we talk about lettering as a group, we typically mean things that are large, logos, headlines, whatever, things that have a lot of kind of pyrotechnics and can be grand. And I like that stuff too, but it's the small-scale lettering that I find especially charming, and I love the way that Gorey used the kinds of tropes of typography to convey legitimacy on the work, using italics for the titles of these made-up books, or using small caps for the attribution of this little aphorism at the top. So he was thinking about letters in three ways: what they look like, what different kinds of letter forms connote, and how type can be used to articulate content. And type designers think about these same three things. This is my terrible handwriting. You'll be seeing a lot of it. I use lettering a lot also, but not in my job as a designer, but rather in communications. One of the ways that our team communicates, the type designers, is through marked up proofs. I find myself indulging in lettering that's maybe more enthusiastic than it needs to be, which is proportional to how tedious the task is. I feel like kerning proofs get a lot of attention because it's late at night and they're exhausting. But I also do what many of us do instinctively, which is to just kind of reach for natural ways to highlight different kinds of information to ensure that they're not unnoticed. This is a note to Sarah Soskolny, one of our designers, who is here in the audience, waving over there. Sarah has always had very kind things to say about my really disgracefully bad scribblings, but I think it's more in the Edward Gorey way of like appreciating that I have a fondness for these kinds of things. I suppose you could look at this note typographically and say it's written in a script, and it's got some small caps that are sans serifs, and it's got this inline thing, and it's got a kind of pen-drawn bold. But I think readers don't spot these things. I think readers read this just as a message. And to me, that is what makes handwriting so much more interesting than calligraphy. Calligraphy, to me, formalizes its mannerisms and the look of its tools and refines them in a particular style, which can be outstanding. But handwriting is less conscious, and I think therefore freer to move from style to style. A note written in capitals, an occasional word in lowercase, doesn't really pass, it's easily ignored in the consumption of the message. Style is incidental to what handwriting is. And I realized that this sort of stylelessness of handwriting is what I'd wanted all those years ago with my wedding map and with Jesse's dictionary. It was the idea that we could somehow meld the versatility of a modern type family with this stylelessness of handwriting. So I wanted something that blended type, calligraphy, and handwriting in different ways. I wanted the versatility of type, but none of type's artificiality. Type, after all, is synthetic, it's institutional, it's anonymous, which is normally one of its strengths in communication. Instead of artificiality, I wanted from calligraphy the organic quality that it has. Calligraphy obviously is handmade, and it's warm, and it's natural. It's the product of the wrist and the elbow and the shoulder, but it also can be mannered, and I didn't want that. In opposition to the manneredness of calligraphy, I wanted the informality of handwriting. And I love the way handwriting has an authorial voice. More than concealing the authorship, it's entirely about it. But then handwriting can often be downright sloppy. So the question was, is it possible to strain out the virtues and shortcomings of these three things and create a typeface that has these three qualities? And that is what begat today's project, Inkwell. Was that a good or a bad? Okay, thank you. Inkwell is an attempt to create a family that feels like it's handwritten text. If you had to and wanted to letter an entire book, what you might do yourself if you had infinite time and patience and skill. It began with drawings I created around 2004. They were originally sketches on paper and later a set of digital fonts. And these were kind of a proof of concept to see if it was worth even pursuing the direction. I wanted this to feel personal, authorial, but also have the versatility of a proper typeface. Deep character set, lots of styles, things like that. Styles that would help authors and designers articulate information the way a bold or an italic might in a more conventional typeface. Like handwriting, I wanted to make sure it wasn't related to any particular typeface or style. I didn't want this to be, hand-drawn Sentinel or hand-drawn Gotham, but I also didn't want it to be a slab serif or an old style. It needed to feel like neatly printed letters. These are some early drawings from 2005 that explore how the idea might develop. I found myself doing things you wouldn't normally do in a typeface, like rendering my small caps as sans serifs, because that's how I write them. I'll be getting back to the headache of that in a little while. But I also wanted to do more with this that one might do with a pen and wouldn't normally do with a typeface, like a black letter, a fun thing to have. I like the idea that this typeface could have both Roman and Gothic letter forms that are related because they're made by the same set of tools. And the more I got into this, the more I wanted to do more, maybe having these kinds of open letters. My dad was a theatrical set designer and did a lot of shop drawings and always labeled plans and elevations like this. This is an engineering letter you'll see on patent applications and blueprints and things. And I think it probably comes from lettering templates like this. And so this sort of got to the idea that if the sans is going to have a more stylized degree of sans in the form of the open, maybe the serif should have a fancy cousin as well. Maybe a Tuscan. A Tuscan is a guilty pleasure of mine. I liked this capital H. The A was kind of a placeholder for what might come later. The thought that there might be a collection of styles that work well together reminded me of things like this. The work of engravers, gilders, the work of Edward Gorey for that matter. where you can create a riotous collage of styles that are united by being the product of the same hand and the same tools. And I think there's a value in that designers don't have access to today. I think about things like this. This is an old photograph from the old Ralph Lauren store that I think is now the Apple store. I'm very seduced by what this typography is going for, and I think it's an okay piece of design, but it's a little bit undermined by the divergent traditions of its typefaces. The Spencerian script on top is a great place to start. The line of italic caps below that is from engraving, which is a close enough relative. Then we get into a typeface that's a 20th century interpretation of Roman inscriptions, and then this kind of Victorian Anglo-German fraktur. It seems to me that this lettering might have been more attractive in the mock-up when the same marker and the same hand drew the entire thing. So I put this away in 2006 to focus on other things. Matthew Carter has memorably said that he's never regretted stepping away from a typeface, and I agree. I think time gives you a perspective that few other things do, and it exerts a sort of evolutionary force on typefaces as well, and thins down the herd. But the other thing besides time that I found helpful in working on a typeface is having someone to share it with, and that opportunity presented itself last year in the form of Mr. Jordan Bell, who is also here today. Raise your hand, Jordan. It's over there. Jordan joined us 3 years ago. He's a typeface designer, and among other things, he's also a compulsive, chronic graphomaniac. These are some of his more exuberant notes that I found on the Inkwell proofs over the year. Some of them are notes to me, some of them are notes to himself, some of them I think are just kind of notes to posterity about what happened at various points in the typeface. When Jordan joined us, we put him through a kind of hazing of having to extend the Archer family into these 3 heavier weights, working with me and our other designer, Andy Clymer. The hardest part of this was making the tabular figures. Tabular figures, as you know, have to all share the same set of widths, which goes against the tendency of fonts to get wider as they get heavier. But Jordan did these, and I think did a really terrific job. Working with another designer is great in that it forces you to articulate your own positions about things as well, to reveal inconsistencies in your own thinking, and to really spot tendencies you didn't know that you had. When we began working on Inkwell together, the first conversation was what serifs should look like. And so this began by my dissecting all of my drawings into this set of rules to see how things work and abstracting a kind of Inkwell Bible from this. By the way, these slides never looked this good until this week. These are all sketches in Illustrator and emails and things like that. But the idea of having a kind of recipe book for a typeface is interesting, especially one like this, where so many of the rules basically are don't follow the rules. Don't make caps and small caps look alike in order to add variety to the typeface. In many ways, Inkwell was about doing things you don't do in typefaces, with the goal being not so much consistency, but variation up until the point where it becomes noticeable. So my bright idea about the small caps being in sans serifs obscured the fact that would mean then doing a sans serif cap to go with them, and also a serif cap to go with the lowercase, which began to feel complicated and hard to engineer, and I get a feeling it would kind of thwart people's expectations. So of course we ended up doing the harder thing, which is a sans serif to go with the serif. Since the serif would have an italic, the question of what the sans serif italic would have was an open one, and I hadn't explored sans serif italics because I really don't write this way, but happily Jordan does. And did these really beautiful drawings, and these have a flavor of sign writing that I like a lot. I think my favorite part of a typeface that we do is always the part that I really didn't do myself, so I can say with sort of full-throated conviction, I love the italic in this one. Jordan was very enthusiastic about the black letter idea as well, which I was pretty psyched about. I'd spent about a decade noodling with how to make an informal black letter, which is, you know, the most kind of formal thing that exists in typography, rendered with a ballpoint pen. These are all sketches on you know, junk mail and receipts and things. I'm bad about sketching. I know designers who have, like, you know, moleskin books that are dated, and I kind of draw everywhere and things go in my wallet. And on the iPad as well. I've got an iPad Pro that I carry all the time and sketch on. So Jordan and I spent last summer trying to find a way to kind of dress down the Gothic capitals, to find a way to make it as close to the Roman as possible in terms of flavor, both by giving its line weights some qualities, and also by simplifying certain characters, taking these archaisms and making them a little bit more modern. The fun of a typeface like this is the back end of the character set, figuring out what these things do. Black letter figures are always a puzzle because they have neither a historical nor cultural nor scribal, I guess, foundation. Jordan made these, and I think they're fantastic. And I think either because I traumatized him with the Archer tabular figures, or just to flex a little bit, he made these tabular figures that telling anybody. Jordan, you're a sick bastard, is all I can say. In the middle of all this, we began talking about weight. I'd imagined Inkwell as a collection of things made with the same pen, which means the same weight. But obviously, designers need boldfaces, and I think designers are fussy about writing implements to begin with, and a typeface that was an extension of this might yield some hot controversy. So we expanded the thing into a set of weights. And I like them in the more sober styles, like the serif Roman, and the cursive ones, like the italic. But I think it's a black letter where things really begin to cook. I'm a black letter fan in general, but I think these are just having a good time in a fun way. The Tuscan we hadn't really revisited, and since deciding to do a set of weights for things, these began to feel really too complex to exist in a bold, so we shelved it, which is a shame because I've been sketching these again for years and years and years. Never worked out the capital O. I've yet to see a Tuscan that has a good, I mean, Tuscans are all about those serifs, and an O being serifless is a bit of a puzzle. But we both did a lot of sketching while the Inkwell project was going on in kind of an Inkwell style. This is a little monogram that I drew that I thought we'd include in the typefaces, and while we didn't, we did both realize that this actually secretly is a Tuscan. So I did some morphological sketches for how things might look, a couple of characters in Robofont, and Jordan took it away. And this is kind of a fun thing to have in the typeface family as well. I like the way this one interpolates, especially where the character changes so dramatically. You have this kind of very bucolic, rustic, lightweight, and then this really burlesque, circus postery heavy. The open got the same treatment as well, and again with some of the sign writer's fluidity that I think Jordan does so well. The final part of all this was wondering what the cursive faces should do, whether the italic should be really a script, or whether it should be a lettered italic in the typographic, in the Edward Gorey sense. We made arguments for both, and therefore decided to do both in the end. People have been asking us for a script for the longest time, and I'm really happy that this one isn't just a typeface we did as a standalone script, but it's part of this kind of broader package of things with the goal of expanding the font family. I want to wrap up just by talking about the type family as a goal for typographers. The notion of the type family and our duties to it is, I think, the most important part of type design. You can look back historically at things that are signal moments in type history. The Aldine italic, 1499 is a great example as the first italic typeface. But more important than Aldus's italic is what it made possible, which is the marriage of Roman and italics that have lasted for 500 years, until today when Ilya killed them at his lecture this morning. I should point out that in English, italics aren't just a stylistic thing, they're actually a linguistic thing. There are sentences you cannot understand without italics. And the placement of italics changes the meaning of things really quite dramatically. Even the Chicago Manual of Style, which urges authors to avoid italics, admits that they are indispensable, and they're a key part of comprehension. So Ilya, I'm fighting you on those italics, and get those back in there. Slab serifs, the same thing. I mean, they were designed as novelty faces, but as soon as they were created in text sizes, they found this new use for boldface, for headwords in dictionaries, and that's the same rule they have today. They exist for this level of semantic emphasis. The type family tree is always growing. Bringhurst illustrates it this way, and I think this reveals the perspective of a book designer about how letter forms work. But my hope is that Inkwell is a family that pushes the envelope in some ways. I'm not sure how designers will use these things, what use they'll find with some of these more exotic styles, but I'm hoping they do indeed have them. Barbara and I were speaking on I guess, the weekend about new kinds of information that these typefaces might address. And I was thinking about things like Wikipedia, where text can be subtly shaded, but it isn't. Wikipedia uses italic and bold, but doesn't use type to distinguish between things like an article, past versions of an article, and commentary. And that's because the entire thing is set in your browser default typeface. But what if it used a typeface that had built-in voices that could help distinguish these three kinds of content using styles that have strong associations, even for non-designers, like Snoopy at the typewriter, things that mean to people writing, that mean old things, that mean conversation. And for that matter, why not use type to separate the site's content from its architecture? Barbara, sort of tongue-in-cheek, asked me what Wikipedia might look like in Inkwell, and I thought I'd give it a shot. So here is what an article might be. Talk, entirely in the conversational script face, and a history page. I want a special mode for the history page that is for people not intimidated by typography. They can really go all out, use all these styles together. In the meantime, I'll settle for seeing what designers do with the typefaces. Hopefully one day I'll see a dictionary and possibly even a map for somebody's wedding. Thank you very much.